7 people. Matching uniforms. A logo on their chest that looked harmless until you realize a logo can be a badge when cowards want one. I was at my shop in town, doing what I'd built my life around after I took off the old badge for good, teaching safety, discipline, responsibility, the kind that keeps people alive, the kind you don't learn from movies, you learn from consequences. And while I was gone, my home got turned into a crime scene that pretended it was. Community policy. I came back to Ironwood Ridge thinking I'd finally found the place where my wife and I could breathe. 3 acres of Texas sky, a wraparound porch, an outbuilding that could become the next chapter of my training work, and a neighborhood whose name sounded like a promise, Liberty Hollow, because you don't name a place like that unless you want people to believe they're safe. And I did my due diligence, every line of the HOA rules, every covenant, every clause, looking for restrictions, finding none that said I couldn't keep my legally owned property secured in my own home, finding nothing that said I couldn't run a small training operation the way I'd planned. And the realtor smiled that easy smile and said the community was liberty-minded. Then moving day came, and I met Rowena Weatherby, the HOA president, a slender woman with hair pulled tight like she was holding her entire worldview together by force. Her smile polite in the way a knife is polite, her eyes narrowing at the locked cases being carried in, like she already hated what they represented. And when I mentioned converting the outbuilding into a training space for advanced students, her smile died on impact. "We're making changes," she said, voice cold, "for safety." That word, safety, said by people who want control, always comes out like a threat dressed up as virtue. That night my wife, Tessa Dalton, a constitutional attorney with a mind sharp enough to cut stone, and I sat on the porch with barbecue and cheap beer, watching the sunset spill gold across the land, trying to believe we were finally in our forever place. And I told myself I'd dealt with harder people than a power-hungry HOA president. I'd stared down criminals who didn't hide behind paperwork. I'd survived real danger. So how bad could she be? The next day my neighbor, Thatcher Ross, a retired police chief with friendly eyes that had seen too much, came over and warned me like a man who doesn't waste words. "Watch yourself," he said. "Rowena's got a crusade. She's pushed people out. She's got a vice president, Douglas Klein, and a rising politician on the board, Eliza Monroe. They rewrite rules like they're editing reality." That evening I went to my first HOA meeting, and the room felt like a courtroom where the verdict was decided before anyone spoke. Rowena controlled the air. Douglas took minutes that barely recorded dissent. Tessa squeezed my hand when Rowena announced a new community safety initiative. And on the way home, I saw a car down the street, someone watching our house. Thatcher frowned and said it was Rowena's nephew, Jerry Weatherby, doing surveillance. Surveillance in a neighborhood that calls itself Liberty. That should have been my first sign the name was a lie. A week later, I was downtown at my business, demonstrating proper maintenance and safety practices to new owners, when my phone rang, and I heard Tessa's voice shaking. Not fear, rage, the kind that comes when someone crosses a line so hard you can feel it in your bones. "Wyatt," she said, "you need to come home right now. They broke in." I closed the shop and drove like my heart was a siren. And when I stepped into our secured room, my stomach dropped. The safes were open, the shelves were cleared, the cases were gone. The space looked stripped, and sitting there like a signature on a theft was a typed notice on HOA letterhead. Something about a new safety regulation, something about HOA jurisdiction, something about how constitutional protections don't apply. Inside the community, I stood there staring, feeling violated in a way I hadn't felt even in the worst parts of my old career. Because criminals break in and you expect it, but this was done by people who wanted to look legal while they did something illegal. People who used the emergency access key homeowners were required to provide, meant for real emergencies like gas leaks or flooding, and used it to enter a home, not to save anyone, but to take. Our neighbor told us he'd seen 7 people, 3 vehicles, uniforms with an HOA logo, moving quickly like it was planned, like it was practiced, like they'd done this before and nobody had stopped them. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. This wasn't just a grudge, it was a system, and systems don't care about your feelings, they care about your compliance. Tessa didn't spiral. She sharpened, laptop open, statutes, precedents, HOA procedures, property law, constitutional issues. She started listing violations like she was stacking bricks for a wall: unlawful entry, theft, misuse of emergency access, abuse of authority, selective enforcement, and the most important part, the HOA's own founding documents. We dug into the so-called regulation, and that's when Rhett Calloway, an elderly longtime resident and former city councilman, slid a paper across his kitchen table like he was passing as contraband. He told us Rowena held a special emergency meeting, announced last minute on a bulletin board, with only her allies present, then claimed a vote, claimed community safety, claimed authority that didn't belong to her. Then Rhett showed us the original covenant clause the developer put in decades ago, a clause about respecting constitutional rights, a clause that couldn't be amended without unanimous homeowner approval, the kind of clause that exists precisely because someone predicted, long ago, that a person like Rowena might come along. I confronted Rowena at the HOA office, slammed the paper down, demanded my property returned, told her I'd call the county sheriff, and she looked at me with something like pain disguised as hate and said, "Your rights end at our gates." Douglas approached me outside with a compromise. He'd return my property if I agreed to abandon my training plans and restrict what I could keep at home, and I refused because I finally saw the trap. If I accepted, I'd be agreeing the HOA had the power to negotiate my rights like they were a favor, not a foundation. Then the harassment started. Fines for absurd violations, daily notices, nonsense designed to drain us, to make us desperate, to make us sell. And when we noticed how the HOA office had upgraded into a sleek corporate-looking headquarters, expensive furniture, security systems, photos of Rowena with politicians, it clicked. The money was going somewhere, and safety was just the curtain. With Thatcher's help, we learned the confiscated property was being stored in a private facility tied to Douglas, and one night, from public ground, we documented what we could, and we heard enough conversation to realize this wasn't temporary storage. This was intent, this was profit, and my blood went cold. Because now it wasn't just overreach. It was a racket. We organized quietly at first, because fear had trained this neighborhood to whisper. We met at Thatcher's place, and the stories poured out. Families fined into exhaustion, widows targeted, veterans harassed, people who just wanted peace punished for existing wrong. And the pattern was the same. Rowena didn't want a community. She wanted control. Tessa found the procedural failures in their emergency meeting, and we filed suit, not just on one right, but on everything they violated: unlawful entry, theft, breach of contract, abuse of authority, fraud. And while we built the case, a reporter, Gloria Vargas, sniffed something rotten because budgets were ballooning, legal fees were inflated, and the HOA's finances looked like a shell game. Then came the hearing, packed room, cameras, neighbors filming because the spell was breaking, and Tessa did what she does best. She made the law feel like a flashlight in a dark room. She showed the judge the covenant clause, the improper meeting, the emergency key misuse, the targeted harassment, and she made it simple. HOAs are not governments, they are not courts, and they do not get to rewrite constitutional reality because a board wants power. The judge ordered immediate return of the property, struck down the regulation, froze the fines, and issued an injunction that clipped Rowena's wings so hard you could almost hear it. And outside the courthouse, Rowena hissed that it wasn't over, that she'd appeal forever. And I looked at her and felt something complicated, because I could see grief under the anger, but grief doesn't give you permission to victimize a neighborhood. Then the recall vote came, and for the first time, the silent majority wasn't silent. Ballots counted under neutral eyes, and the board got removed in a landslide. Douglas tried to scramble. Eliza tried to distance herself like she'd never been part of it. And county investigators, now watching the money and the paper trail, brought charges where they belonged. The final closure wasn't just my property being returned. It was watching a community become a community again. HOA meetings turning into discussions instead of trials. Fines replaced with fairness. Neighbors lifting their heads. And my wife, tired but smiling, telling me they thought power was a weapon, but power is just permission, and we revoked it. Months later, we sat on the porch again, sunset the same, air quieter, and I realized what this story really was. It wasn't about an HOA and a rule. It was about what happens when ordinary people let fear become routine, and what happens when one person says, "No, not here, not to us, not again." And here's the question I want you to wrestle with, because it's not as clean as people want it to be. If someone uses safety to justify violating your home and taking your legally owned property, and the community stays quiet because they're scared, do you have a moral obligation to fight for everyone, even when it puts your own family at risk? And if you win, was it justice? Or was it just the system finally noticing because you had the resources to be loud? And what do we do with the uncomfortable truth that many victims never get that chance?